If there was one thing Ciabha had in abundance, it was roads and rivers. If those paths and waterways could speak, the stories they would tell could keep you enraptured for centuries. Alas, while their silence prevails, mine does not. And I would like to tell you of a place called Ciabha, and two girls who lived there called Caitlin and Evie. Situated almost exactly between the beautiful island of Ireland and the British Isles was Ciabha, a small piece of land at a mere 18 kilometres north to south, making it a perfectly placed pit stop for anyone making the journey in between. The frequency of these journeys had rendered this once modest place into a thriving metropolis. Set apart by its governance, Ciabha was its own sovereign state, run by a group of elected people referred to as the council. Many a commercial enterprise had set up shop as the tax benefits put in place by said council had been too good to miss. On this day upon the island, a bus accommodating exactly 23 souls, including the driver, had transported Evie and Caitlin to their final destination. As the bus pulled into the side of the road, it spluttered and spattered in protest. The council, among other things, seemed oblivious to the existence of electrical vehicles, and the majority of public transport was on its last legs. When the colossal beast finally lumbered to a stop, the girls were jolted forward, almost into the lap of the driver. Gathering their bag and their nerves, they made their way down the steps and onto the cracked pavement below. The road stretched out in both directions as far as the eye could see. Each residence was concealed from sight behind a long avenue of pine trees. The recent rain had left their heavy, musky scent lingering in the air. Cars whizzed up and down the main road, and the two girls eyed the stony, broken footpath with trepidation as they began to walk. Caitlin felt Evie's eyes appraising her from head to toe. They were the only two people on the long footpath and dressed almost identically. The petite girl smiled and extended her hand. "I'm Evie. Are you interviewing too?" Caitlin shook the other girl's hand gratefully. Truth be told, she was interviewing, but she had only made the decision yesterday. Caitlin wasn't from the island, she was originally from Dublin. 3 days ago, she had decided to apply for a new job. Yesterday, she had agreed to an interview. And this morning, she had boarded the ferries and sailed her way to a new life. Knowing no one, she had been regretting her impulsiveness ever since she stepped off the boat. Now, falling into step beside Evie, excitement gradually replaced her anxiety. She continued down the path, eager for what lay ahead. As they walked along, the conversation flowed. Evie had lived on the island her entire life and had always wanted to work at Carmichael's. One of the most famous and oldest department stores in the world, people would make the pilgrimage just to visit the hallowed ground. Twice a year, one designer would be picked to show their new collections exclusively before the beginning of London Fashion Week. While the rest of the world struggled to keep the high street alive in the face of online consumerism, Carmichael's had easily stayed afloat due to reputation alone, and of course the tax benefits that I mentioned earlier. If you were a sales assistant at Carmichael's, it wasn't the same as being a sales assistant at any ordinary shop, and for Evie, it was a means to an end. Evie was a singer with a beautiful and distinctive voice, but she could only sing other people's songs. Many times she had tried to write or compose, but it seemed impossible to her. She had posted videos of multiple covers across various social media platforms, but had never been picked up by the algorithm. She remained lost among a million other voices, desperately trying to be heard. So, she had come up with a plan. Working at Carmichael's, she would meet all different types of people from the industry, and maybe if she met the right person, they could help her. Caitlin listened and started to quite admire the girl. It wasn't the worst idea. Carmichael's was always closing down for visiting celebrities to shop without the inevitable hordes of fans following them, and Evie wouldn't get that type of access anywhere else. As the budding pop star reached the end of her explanation, she turned to Caitlin and asked, "Why did you apply?" Caitlin looked at her, and for a moment considered telling her the truth. There was something in Evie's sweet face that was trustworthy, but in the last moment, she bit her tongue, shrugged her shoulders and said, "Fancy the change." They passed gate upon gate as they walked along the long road, until eventually they came upon the storehouse, a huge sprawling mansion originally owned by the Carmichael family and now used as a training centre among other things, and served as the location for all the store's interviews. As the automatic ornamental gates opened, what appeared to be a delivery van emerged, its tyres crunching loudly over the white marble gravel. The driver, his blonde hair reminiscent of Owen, caused his face to flash through Caitlin's mind, and she felt the fleeting, familiar pang of pain in her chest. She closed her eyes. Upon reopening them, she found her new friend saluting the van as if the driver was a military captain. Evie noticed Caitlin's look and laughed, pointing to the graphics on the side that showcased the company's name. She explained that not saluting a magpie would bring bad luck. Caitlin shook her head, feeling a giggle bubbling up. Soon they were both on the brink of hysterics. It was their first time doing this, but certainly not the last. The brief walk to the interview marked the beginning of their friendship, a memory cherished. Approaching the front door, their laughter died down, giving way to nerves. The door, painted with a thick red lacquer, boasted a sizable brass knocker. Just as Caitlin reached for it, Evie nudged her attention to an intercom discreetly placed at the side but clearly marked, "Please press for attention." Caitlin's initial attempt to use the ornamental knocker prompted a shared desire to laugh once more. By the time the door finally swung open, the Carmichael security guard was met with the sight of two 22-year-olds, once again bordering on hysteria. Casting a disapproving glance their way, which quieted their laughter and restored their previous nerves, he stood to the side as the two girls ascended the steps to enter the foyer of the old house. Caitlin stood at the threshold, utterly captivated at the sight of the beautiful interior. She was so entranced that she didn't even hear Evie call her name. "Sorry, what?" Caitlin snapped back to reality in time to hear Evie chuckle at her confusion. "I'm going first, then I'll wait for you." Nodding absent-mindedly and barely registering Evie's departure from the room, Caitlin gazed around in wonder. She had never set foot on the island before, but she had heard about it at length from Owen. Yet somehow she was slowly realising that she had been in this room before. The furniture was different, the walls a different colour, but she knew at first glance that opulent, ornate stucco ceilings were original, as was the mirror. Still in a daze, she walked across to where the magnificent piece stood and studied the intricate filigree patterns adorning the frame. The sheer size commanded attention, and as she shifted her focus from the framework to the glass, she began to see. At first there was nothing different. The reflection that gazed back was no different from the one that had stared back at her earlier that morning before she had set out to catch the ferry. Her blonde hair was neatly pulled back into a ponytail, her makeup was clean and understated, and she wore the uniform of almost every other girl her age who was interviewing. Smart black trousers and a black t-shirt. But it was as if the image was fading, revealing another underneath. Her face remained the same, but her blue eyes now gazed at a sombre yet elegant ensemble. The dark, luxurious silk of the dress had a high waistline and a flowing floor-length skirt. A delicate black veil contrasted with the fairness of her hair. And just as she was about to look down to see if she really was wearing black gloves, the reflection of a woman suddenly appeared at her shoulder. Caitlin jumped back in shock. Now it was just her again. Modern black outfit, no gown, no veil. She blinked again and again, but nothing changed. It was just her, and no one else was in the room. After the interviews concluded, the two girls walked down the driveway towards the gates. Evie had asked Caitlin if she would like to join her for a coffee in town, and since the ferry ran every hour until 10 p.m, Caitlin had readily accepted. They decided to walk since it wasn't a long distance from the storehouse to Tate's, the cafe that Evie had mentioned. The centre of the island was often referred to as the city centre, which in truth it was. However, the entire island comprised the city, with suburbs and various neighbourhoods spread across the Skerry. Tate's was located in the northeast corner and was older than Carmichael's, which was also only a short distance away. No one quite knew how long they had been trading at that corner, but the couple who ran the coffee shop liked to claim they'd been there forever. Tate's coffee shop stood on Crescent Hill, a road that once separated the main town from the lands beyond before the canal was built. The south and north ports on the island welcomed trade from all corners of the globe, but what lay beyond to the east, and the lands beyond, was not a port that could be easily sailed into. Walking towards the coffee shop, Caitlin couldn't help but be gripped by a strange feeling of déjà vu, much like before. The road they were walking on was called Summer Gardens, adjacent to the road where the storehouse stood. Once it had housed some of the most important people on the island, but as the years passed, the terrace mansions had been bought by developers and converted into apartments. Caitlin stopped outside number 27. There was a huge tree in the garden, its long branches hanging over the driveway. She breathed deeply, inhaling the scent, so familiar she knew it better than, "Are you okay?" She found herself standing outside the garden while Evie was now several feet ahead. Forgetting about the déjà vu, she quickly ran to catch up. Arriving at the coffee shop, Caitlin followed Evie inside, taking in the bustling scene before her. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of coffee beans and pastries, parents gathered around tables with their respective buggies, couples nestled in dark corners, lost in each other's eyes, and students diligently tapped away on their laptops. Suddenly the room swam before her eyes, just like when she had looked into the mirror. Now she was standing in the room as it had been before, the heady scent of fresh coffee mixed with thick tobacco smoke. Oil camps cast a warm glow onto the male patrons, conspicuous with their powdered wigs and tricorn hats. Their loud discussions of trade and politics rang with information they had gleaned from the many newspapers strewn across the dark oak tables. Behind the counter stood a woman with piercing dark eyes, one of the few females in the room. She smiled at Caitlin, and even after the image disappeared, the lady remained, still smiling behind the counter. "Auntie Brenda," Evie called out, grabbing Caitlin with one hand and frantically waving with the other. The dark-haired lady lifted the ledge and walked over the busy floor to meet the two girls. The following Saturday, Evie sat excitedly in her aunt's car at the north docks of the island waiting for the Dublin ferry to port. The previous week, both Evie and Caitlin had received the promised phone calls, offering them positions as beauty experts in Carmichael's. Caitlin had almost refused the job altogether. Ciabha was going through somewhat of a housing crisis, and she had found it almost impossible to find somewhere to share, but her hesitation wasn't due to this, or the amount of commuting she would be forced into doing if she stayed in Dublin. The ferry barely took half an hour, but the traffic to and from the port on both sides would eat into her day. And it wasn't her friends either. Since she had broken up with Chrissy, she had lost most of her friend group, and it definitely wasn't going to be because she was going to hang around just in case. Owen wasn't even in Dublin anymore, but as far as she knew, so it wasn't like she even had the option of running into him. And since the sound of his name had become unbearable, the thought of actually seeing him, even on socials, made her feel sick. This meant that she had no idea what he nor Chrissy were up to. Not that she cared about Chrissy, but she let people think that she did. Then they were less likely to mention Owen, and she could go back to pretending like they had never met. Maybe one day she would make herself believe it. No, it wasn't any of these things. The real truth was she was scared. Something was calling to her on that island, and she didn't know what it was. Eventually, after all the debating back and forth, it was solved with a simple message. Evie had texted to say her aunt's had a studio apartment available in one of the houses in Summer Gardens. She had sent photographs, and not only had Caitlin fallen in love at first sight, but she had realised it was number 27, the same building that she had stopped outside of the day of her interview. She didn't tell anyone, but now stronger than her fear was the sense that if she took this apartment, she would be going home. Flinging open the passenger door, Evie ran towards Caitlin as she spotted her blonde head in the crowd and threw her arms around her excitedly. "I can't believe it. Everything is working out just the way it's supposed to." Caitlin laughed, nodding her head, then stopped suddenly, pointing to a line of trucks pouring out of the commercial exit on the docked ferry. "Look!" Evie turned to see the line of electric articulated lorries rolling down the heavy steel ramps, each emblazoned with their lucky magpie on the side. "Quick! Salute!" The two girls simultaneously raised their hands to the side of their heads, saluting the truck smartly before bursting into shared laughter. Later that evening, Caitlin explored her new home. Evie had departed only half an hour earlier. She had wanted to stay longer, but Caitlin had forced her to go to choir practice. She smiled to herself, reflecting on the genuine kindness of Evie's aunts. They had given her a quick tour of her new surroundings as they drove in from the docks. Caitlin had almost shared her hallucination from her first day in their coffee shop with Brenda, but had decided against starting her tenancy with such an unusual tale. The houses themselves dated back to the early 1800s. Following a great fire at the end of the 18th century, everything had been rebuilt, and the once grand homes were now divided into apartments of various shapes and sizes. Caitlin's studio was located on the second floor. Despite her efforts to unpack, she found herself being repeatedly drawn back to the huge window that dominated one wall. The view was breathtaking. Situated on Crescent Hill, the elevation allowed her to see across to the lands beyond, all the way out to the ocean. Although she didn't experience any visions like she had in the coffee shop, she felt an inexplicable connection to this place. Gazing out, she couldn't shake the feeling. If she concentrated hard enough, she would glimpse the lands beyond as they once had been. But above all, now that she had made the move, she knew it was the right decision. Even if it didn't make sense, she was home. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, unusually warm for the end of January. This was Caitlin's day off, and she had more than relished the opportunity to sleep in. It was hard to ignore the fact that she and Evie had barely enjoyed any time off since starting their new jobs. The rosters were constantly changing at the last minute, and being beauty experts wasn't nearly as glamorous as they had once imagined. Most of their time was spent ringing up purchases at the main tills. Any attempt to offer advice was thwarted by the brand's own beauty consultants, protective over their counters and commissions. Carmichael's core staff would sometimes disappear for hours, leaving the new staff members to manage on their own. Despite complaints to management, any concerns seemed to fall on deaf ears. She still enjoyed it though. She loved working with Evie and their new friend Veronique, whom they had met on their first day. Veronique was also one of the core staff, but she was lovely, nothing like the others. Whenever one of the girls did something wrong, she would be there first, guiding them and showing them the right way, before any of the management could even notice they had made a mistake. Some of the core staff began to warm up to the two girls. More than once it had been commented that they did things old school, and that was just the way the core staff liked it. Now as she strolled along Summer Gardens, the quiet was suddenly shattered by a high-pitched voice squealing her name. Evie had been asked at the last minute to work that Saturday morning, and as it was only a 4-hour shift, she had agreed. Looking up to see if she could spot the source of the noise, Caitlin saw someone waving at the end of the street, and realising it was an extremely overexcited Evie, both screaming and jumping up and down. "Guess what? Guess what?" Caitlin was gasping. She had run the last few metres and was now out of breath. It wasn't helped by the fact that Evie was grabbing her shoulders and trying to spin her round, not giving her a chance to speak, let alone answer. "Stop, what happened?" Caitlin managed as Evie finally gave up on the spinning. "David Rowan's on the island and he's asked me to audition for Rowan Records." It turned out her crazy plan had actually kind of worked. That morning, the world-famous record producer had woken up and realised his personal assistant had forgotten to pack his aftershave. She had been immediately dispatched to Carmichael's to purchase a bottle and return as soon as possible. Of course, as soon as the red-eyed, sniffling personal assistant entered the beauty hall, Evie recognised her straight away. Thanks to her constant online stalking of not just the top of the music industry, but their staff as well. Evie rushed forward to help, listening as the girl poured out the whole sorry affair. The personal assistant had been so grateful for Evie's shoulder that she had asked if there was anything she could do in return. After listening to a few notes of Evie's covers as they stood at the fragrance counter, the personal assistant was immediately impressed and texted her boss right then and there asking him to listen. Apparently, he had texted her back immediately and told her to get Evie's details so they could set up a meeting when they returned the following month. Evie was confident that her voice was unique. The fact that she hadn't been discovered was just timing. Okay, so she couldn't write or play instruments, but she had tried countless times. It seemed like all her talent had gone solely into her voice and nowhere else, but surely that had to mean something. Caitlin didn't mind. She could listen to Evie singing forever. However, one faithful friend alone would not make a successful singer. But now, with David Rowan coming to the island just to meet with her, Evie might finally get the recognition that she deserved. The next few weeks passed without much event. Evie and Caitlin worked almost every day at Carmichael's. Now it was Saturday evening and closing time was drawing near. Evie had gone into the manager's office to speak to them about a problem with her audition, which had been arranged for the following Thursday. She had already arranged to have the day off, but when they received their new rosters for the week the night before, she had found herself scheduled to work. Caitlin was meticulously facing off, walking around all the counters and rearranging all the products so they faced in the right direction. Labels to the left. It might have seemed like a small and seemingly unimportant task, but even if one bottle was out of place, it ruined the entire aesthetic. She remembered the first time she had worked in the pharmacy. She had rearranged her entire makeup stand so everything was colour coordinated, thinking her boss would be pleased. Instead, she had been screamed at and spent the rest of the day rearranging the products exactly as the diagram from the brand's head office had instructed. Creativity on a makeup counter? Unheard of. She stood at the entrance, hands on her hips, surveying the floor, searching for any containers out of place, when suddenly she saw Evie come running out of the manager's office, her hands to her face, sprinting towards the staff room. The manager followed calmly, turning to lock the office door as Caitlin caught what looked like a smirk, but by the time she had glanced back, the manager's normal serious expression had resumed. Caitlin, you're supposed to be facing off. Why are these products out of place? Caitlin looked around and noticed one stand with some lipsticks lying on their side. They must have fallen when Evie slammed the door. Before she had the chance to answer, the manager swept past her and tutted, "This isn't good enough. You'll be marked down for this." As Caitlin looked at her retreating back, she noticed the clock was just about to strike 8 p.m. She knocked down the remaining lipsticks, and now they were all on their sides, and walked towards the staff room to find her friend. "She's a fucking bitch!" Evie's face was a mess from crying. All the makeup she had carefully applied that morning was now in ruin, except for 2 clear brown lines down the centre where her tears had been falling ever since they had both left work half an hour earlier. Caitlin had immediately ushered Evie to her studio to keep her away from the prying eyes and ears of the other staff, who were dying to know the ins and outs of the latest drama. Evie had not stopped crying or shouting to explain anything to Caitlin, so technically she was just as much in the dark as the rest of the staff anyway. But it seemed that now, finally, the sobs were beginning to slow and Evie was calming down. Caitlin waited patiently for her to speak. Still choking to get the words out, Evie began to explain the night's events. She'd gone into the office to inquire about the holiday and was told that no such request had been made. Evie had gone to show them the email that she had sent, but there was none, neither in her sent folder or her inbox. She remembered receiving it. She had shown it to Caitlin. It was this manager herself who had signed off on it. Evie had been genuinely confused and asked to see the current roster, and that's when she realised. Evie remembered Lilith approaching this manager and asking for Thursday off, and she recalled the manager saying she would see what she could do. Evie remembered this specifically because she didn't like Lilith. Actually, she hated her. But she still felt sorry for her because she knew there was no chance Lilith would be able to get the day off. It had been hard enough for them to get it approved for Evie. So it didn't make sense when Evie looked at the tablet her boss was holding because Lilith's name was now in place of her own. Caitlin sat in shocked silence as her friend came to the end of the story. If this was true, which Caitlin knew it was because she had seen the email, there would be no way of proving it, except by going to IT and demanding they find the original. But that would be futile. As Veronique often reminded them, core staff were core staff for a reason. Some of those people had been there for over 40 years, and that hierarchy went all the way to the top in every department. Accusations from 2 new girls against a manager in her 40s who had first stepped onto the floor as a 17-year-old not only would fall on those same deaf ears, but as the girls were both still on probation, they would also be handed a P45. "I think I have an idea," Caitlin finally spoke. They were sitting by the window. They had dragged the large 3-seater couch from the wall and placed it facing the window. Caitlin loved that she and Evie were now staring over the same collection of trees that the builders had looked upon when they were rebuilding the property after the fires. This window had witnessed all the other houses and buildings that had sprung up over time. Whoever had chosen to look out and had seen it all. She forced herself back to the present. The view wasn't going to change anything for Evie. She would need to take this to extremes. What? Evie's tears had almost completely subsided and a slow anger was beginning to replace them. "You're not going to like it. Get to the fucking point, Caitlin. Fuck Carmichael's and get a new job." Evie rolled her eyes. "Yeah, because they're everywhere. All I need to do is look out this huge fucking window. Look, there's a fucking job over there." Evie was now on her feet, sarcastically pointing out the window to the trees in the distance. "Shut up and listen." Caitlin pulled on Evie's sleeve roughly, forcing her to sit down beside her. She had the island's small social media site, mainly used by locals, open on her phone. It was full of gossip, things for sale, and most importantly, an employment section. In the search bar, she had typed "immediate start." The first option that came up was warehouse assistant, no experience necessary, and the pay was only slightly less than what they were currently earning. Evie took the phone and looked at the words on the screen. She knew the warehouse. Everyone who worked in Carmichael's did. It had opened the previous year and the department store had immediately begun using them as an overflow service. Carmichael's, who had their own online delivery service long before anyone else, were rumoured to be soon using the warehouse to outsource all their logistics work, which was currently causing outrage at the department store. If Carmichael's eliminated entire departments and outsourced work privately, it could have devastating consequences for everyone who worked there. But Evie no longer cared about being loyal to her colleagues. Why should she? They didn't care about her. The real problem was that if she took this job, she could never go back to work there. Carmichael's was hard to get into, even harder to be kept. But if you were? The famous department store was one of the many enterprises on the island owned by the council, and any positions offered came with benefits that made them lifelong jobs. Wages increased every year, guaranteed mortgages and loans, even guaranteed housing in certain areas. The list was endless. Yes, it truly was one of the most coveted. If Evie left, she'd never have the option to return. But if she smashed the audition, she wouldn't even be living on the island, let alone needing a job on it. She looked up at Caitlin and laughed. The next day, the two girls had planned to go walking in Robertson Park, a vast public space located at the centre of Summer Gardens. Their favourite bench overlooked the canal and offered a great view of the ancient water wheel that had once belonged to the island's doomed distillery. That morning at 9:32, Caitlin had received a text from Evie announcing she had an interview for the warehouse at 11 a.m. It was now 11:45 and Caitlin was leisurely strolling through the park towards the bench where she had arranged to meet her friend. It was close to the rose bushes and Caitlin loved the smell. She adored the whole place. Originally built and planted as a private garden for the Robertson family, their family estate had once stood here as well, but they had been lost to the fires. The Robertsons had used it as a pleasure garden for themselves and their circle, and it remained one of the most beautiful parks on the island. Caitlin could see her friend's curly hair as she ran through the traffic towards the entrance of the gardens. She gasped as a taxi nearly clipped the small girl as she skipped onto the footpath, still running, completely oblivious to the chaos behind her. Watching Evie bound ever closer, Caitlin hastily stood up and managed to catch her friend mid-bound as she hurtled towards her with excitement. They jumped up and down, hugging and laughing, no words needed. As they finally broke apart and before Caitlin could say congratulations, Evie handed her a business card. Caitlin studied the plain-looking card and didn't think much of it. She didn't recognise the name either. Turning it around, she read the back. She saw a small printed magpie in the corner. She looked up at Evie in surprise. They've rebranded because of all the people who think they're going to steal everyone's jobs. That's who owns all those fucking vans. Caitlin turned around the card in her hand again, feeling a sense of significance she couldn't quite place. Up until now, whenever she saluted one of the vans, it was just because it reminded her of her friend and the fun that they'd had at the interview. But now as she totted up all the times they had saluted the vans and something good had happened, she realised maybe there was something more to it. This feeling wasn't as strong as the déjà vu, but it was definitely something. Suddenly she realised that since she had moved here, she had thought about him less and less. Was this magic, for want of a better word, something to do with it? Who's Owen? Evie asked. Caitlin went silent. She didn't know what had made her say his name out loud, nor why she had even thought of him. She noticed that the air had turned cold, and the laughter from only a few minutes before had evaporated. He's no one, Caitlin said, and Evie didn't ask again. The morning dawn was fantastic. Caitlin had lain in bed, unable to sleep for the whole night, unable to stop thinking about last year. Why did she imagine that if she ran away from her memories, that they wouldn't find her? She allowed herself to think about the first time that she had seen him. She had been walking down the street with Chrissy, holding his hand while focusing on the passing shops, quite content, when her boyfriend suddenly let out a shout. Owen! She looked at the boy walking towards them, her eyes locked with his, and she was lost. As the early morning rays crept over the floors, almost reaching her bed in the corner, she didn't even notice. She had no time for the beauty of the dawn as she wallowed in her own sadness. She took out her phone and for the first time in a long while, she began to write. The words flowed easily onto the page. It was like she could channel her feelings. She didn't want to talk about him, didn't even want to think about him. But for some reason as she wrote, her feelings dissipated slightly and she began to feel some relief. When she walked into work 3 hours later, she felt light and excited to share with Evie what she had written. Her best friend was dejectedly arranging perfumes on the tray, ensuring every speck of dust was gone and they were at a perfect angle. This is so stupid, she thought, as if anyone is going to notice if they're crooked. She looked up just as a magpie delivery van was driving past the building. She shivered. It felt like a sign that she had made the right decision, to be brave. Upon hearing Caitlin's news, she knew she was right. What tune will I sing it in? Evie had read Caitlin's words with amazement. It was the most beautiful black ballad she had ever read, so poignant and soulful. I don't know, Caitlin replied. I just started writing, I didn't even think about a tune. Maybe we could ask someone to write one? No. The statement was final. This is our song. We're going to do this ourselves. It was finally the day of the audition. Evie had walked out of Carmichael's the previous day and had not made a whisper about the fact that she would be leaving without working her notice and would be starting a new position with the one place everyone unanimously hated. She had explained her plans at the interview and her new boss had immediately offered to switch Evie to an earlier shift for the day. She'd be starting at 6 a.m, helping to clean the warehouse before the 8 a.m. induction, so she could slip off at 10 a.m. and have plenty of time to get ready for the audition, without losing too many paid hours in the process. Evie couldn't believe her luck. It really felt like all eyes were on the prize, and even fate had jumped in to help. As she started down the footpath towards the warehouse, the darkness still blanketed the surroundings due to the early hour. Every 10 feet, pools of golden light from the streetlights above illuminated the way. As she approached the gates, she began to sing. The song that Caitlin had written was beautiful, but without telling her, Evie had actually spent every minute crafting a melody. Crafting was perhaps the wrong term. Evie didn't know how to play notes or compose music. Instead, she learned the words by heart and using her phone recorded every variation of every melody she could think of. When she was satisfied, she practiced it repeatedly until, just like the words, she could recall the entire thing by memory. She didn't want to record it in full. She planned to do a run-through with Caitlin in the hours before the audition, and she really, really wanted her to be the first person to hear. As she sang, Evie became lost in the song. It was magical, seeming to fill the air around her. This could honestly be the most beautiful song ever sung. It was as if even the birds were harmonising as they watched this small girl spread her arms wide and close her eyes, belting out the chorus. At first, he didn't know what it was. He simply felt the adjustment in the wheels and the loud bump. The vehicle was electric, but it had a sensor that beeped to warn anyone there was a silent 10-ton articulated truck reversing in a dark goods entrance. His sensor had been broken for a while, but there wasn't anyone here at 5:30 a.m. The staff didn't even start until 7. Evie's broken body lay sprawled upon the road. The driver, having finally departed his cab upon realising what had happened, ran to her. With one hand, he called the emergency services while he used the other to support himself as he lay down beside the tiny girl he had just crushed beneath his truck, hoping that somehow she would feel another presence and know that she wasn't alone. He saw her trying to focus on something as the life slipped from her eyes. Then he felt her body relax as she died. He couldn't fathom what she had been looking at. The only thing on the back of his lorry was the company logo, a magpie. Caitlin sat Evie's memorial card upon the windowsill in the room where they had both spent so many happy days. She couldn't believe her friend was gone. Was this her life now? A series of unending loss, meeting people she could truly bond with only to have them taken away with no explanation? She sat down and kept staring out of the window. Almost without thinking, she took out the book that Kira and Brendan, Evie's aunts who owned the coffee shop, had given her. She had been asking them questions about the island's history, especially Summer Gardens. She still felt such a connection to her new apartment. They told her this book would have everything she needed to know. Written on the island in 1798, it had been discovered years later, long after the fires. No surviving paintings or much else from that time. It really conjured up a picture of what life must have been like. She began to read. Cloaks and Daggers, 1798. These words were composed beneath the soft, gentle glow of the moon. For I dare not ignite my candle. I still fear detection, even now, in this solitary existence. Alas, I am the sole survivor, as this once proud city lies in ruin, with those who vowed to shield it faithfully departed, taking with them my dearest love. Hunger and poverty, relentless companions, threaten what little remains. I deem myself no wordsmith, and in the midst of learned gentlemen my discourse would not be sought. Alas, since my gaze cannot extend beyond tomorrow, I turn my contemplation to the bygone, seeking to fathom the origins of the flames that besieged our shores. Chastity, a virtue delicately held by young women, is to be guarded assiduously, ensuring the preservation of her good reputation and sparing her family from the stain of shame. Regrettably, young men of differing social standings find delight in the pursuit of these ladies, weaving promises of enduring love meant to be honoured. Alas, more often than not, these vows are abandoned in the aftermath of release, as the young man discovers an inclination towards freedom that surpasses his regard for the chaste young lady he has just ensnared. Consequently, she is left to confront the disapproving gaze of her family and the discernment of the parish. When news of the latest enterprise in London's Pall Mall by Harding, Howell and Co. reached the island in 1796, it was met with great anticipation. The prospect of such an establishment within their own city was indeed a cause for delight. When Carmichael's opened their welcoming doors in the mild winter of 1797, the island's fashionable ladies flocked in great numbers. Eager to relish the freedom of unchaperoned excursions, they browsed the fine assortment of garments, furs and decor to grace their homes. Having indulged their material inclinations, these esteemed matrons and maidens alike would ascend to the upper levels for refreshments. Having sated their sweet appetite for shopping, they could now satiate their yearning for the more savoury delight of scandal and gossip. "My dearest Jacqueline, what a fine beauty you have become. And Eliza, I trust that you are sharing your sister's excitement at our splendid news." The Greys were taking tea on the uppermost level of Carmichael's, which had become the fashionable custom for a certain class of women on Ciabha. Jacqueline, the eldest of the two sisters, had recently become engaged to a gentleman from one of the more distinguished families. This was the third woman to extend her congratulations to both mother and daughter for such a delightful pairing. Plans were to be made, and indeed their outing to Carmichael's this morning to peruse the various silks and laces was necessitated by the need to purchase materials for the fashioning of Jacqueline's wedding gown. Eliza held her sister in the highest regard and was ecstatic with joy at the prospect of her being wed to such a handsome fellow. She could only wish when it came for her turn to marry, she too would be promised to such a gentleman. "Thank you, Miss Tate, and I hope that you and your dear sister could join us in the coming days for a modest celebration in our home. It would be an honour." Mrs. Gray was very fond of the two ladies, sisters and proprietors of the coffee house near their home in Summer Gardens, a well-run, respectable establishment that her husband and his peers frequented often. For a century and longer, the island's gentlemen had convened in coffee houses. Engaging in conversation on matters of commerce and politics, the newspapers regaled the men with tales of woe afflicting the French, whispers of a potential Irish uprising, and numerous ships were observed departing from America from every port across the island. The isle had maintained a prudent distance from the troubles of war, serving merely as a stepping stone for passing soldiers, but no more. Governed by a small group of men, peace prevailed among them. Other men who lacked the same connections suffered greatly. Lands once tilled by humbler inhabitants were now bestowed upon the newcomers as the populace increased, casting a shadow and poverty of crime on this place I call home. In the month of January in the year of 1798, a palpable stir fluttered through the hearts of the less fortunate of the island. These individuals, who would not dare enter near the prestigious doors of the many businesses lining the banks of the principal river, found their abode within the lands beyond. These were humble constructs of huts and cottages nestled discreetly behind the new canal, designed to facilitate the passage of livestock and sundry goods, embarking on frequent journeys from the island to distant shores for trade. Upon the canal, a new distillery had been erected. The construction of the water wheel drew many to both Robertson's Gardens and the canal bridge, allowing them to witness this remarkable feat of engineering. The anticipation on this day was notable, for it not only marked the commencement of the grand water wheel's turning, but the distillery would provide gainful employment to the less fortunate men, enabling them to sustain their wives and children. The lands beyond had earned its ill repute. Any scoundrel or thief, it seemed, hailed from there. For a considerable time it posed a menace for the law-abiding citizens of Ciabha, dissuading them from particular roads, apprehensive that their carriage and their horse might be seized in exchange for their finery and gold, and occasionally their women. To venture deeply onto the East River necessitated travel on a road known to all as Dead Man's Row. Lined by trees that had weathered centuries, their branches had served as gallows for many. Bodies would sway in the breeze from the river, rotting corpses released from tightened nooses would descend to the ground like autumn leaves, only to be interred thereafter in the kiln. A burial ground for those deemed unworthy of consecrated earth, a cruel custom prevalent in this modest corner of the world. As I offer prayers for those departed souls, my fervent hope extends to others like them, who are destined to grace this earth. May they encounter a more compassionate fate in their struggle. The savoury of the lands beyond had appeared in the personage of a Mr. Albert Toller, a man of remarkable enterprise both on land and sea. Never one to neglect an opportunity, he had discovered the land beyond the canal, which to his satisfaction was both reasonably priced and readily available for acquisition. Having recently relocated to the island, he had quickly made himself indispensable to the council, employing whatever means was necessary to secure his position. Without delay, he had arranged a lease of 100 years, commissioning the island's men to build a distillery. His ambition was nothing less than to rival his Scottish and Irish cousins, with the aim of producing a whisky of such quality that it would be regarded as the finest ever crafted. Pause.